Hello and welcome to this session on corporate social responsibility disclosures, assurance of corporate social responsibility disclosures. Now, if you've been around for the last 10, 20 years, you will know this whole issue of CSR has become a totally topical one. The origins of this subject date back some 50, 60 years where a certain realization was arrived at that companies need to live beyond just making an economic profit, and that they had obligations to society that go beyond the profit motive. So several scholars have come up with the idea, for instance, that for any proper CSR activity to be carried out, it should have a focus on legal requirements, the meeting of legal requirements, the meeting of social requirements, the meeting of economic requirements, and then a certain discretionary capacity to sort of allocate funds or resources to things like corporate philanthropy, things like cost-related marketing, things like community volunteering, and so on and so forth. What I want to focus on in this session is a certain look at assurance of CSR disclosures. So my methodology will be that I'll look at what CSR assurance is, then I'll go on to look at arguments for assurance of CSR disclosures. I'll also be careful to look at arguments against assurance of CSR disclosures. Then I'll look at the nature of CSR assurance in Ghana, and I'll look at the factors influencing the assurance of CSR disclosures in Ghana. So at the end of this session, I'm hoping that you, the listener, or you who are watching, will be able to understand and explain the state of assurance of CSR disclosures in Ghana, be able to examine and discuss the factors that influence the assurance of CSR disclosures in Ghana. So let's begin with some basic definitional issues. What is CSR assurance? Now, CSR assurance is the review of the reliability of a CSR report in order to establish the integrity and validity of its disclosures. Now, several local and multinational firms are now typically issuing CSR reports and are giving it various names like CSR reports, social responsibility reports, sustainability reports. Some call it corporate philanthropy reports. Some call it environmental sustainability reports. But irrespective of the nomenclature that comes with this CSR disclosure, it is still very important to establish the integrity and validity of these disclosures. Now, an emerging issue that has come about largely because of increasing stakeholder concerns and pressure is about how valid CSR reports are and how valid CSR practices are. Now, this discussion can happen on two fronts. You could have, for instance, in the first iteration, issues attendant to the CSR activities a company is carried out. Do they really deliver value to those who operate in the stakeholder web of that institution? So from shareholders to stockholders to employees to customers to those who sit along the supply chain of the firm, you want to find out typically whether or not your CSR practices are delivering value to these multiple stakeholder audiences. Then a step two, or a second level of the discussion, will be what you finally report as the conduct of your CSR activities. Are these reports valid, or have you been deceived into maybe overbloating the importance of what you did, or indeed trying to hide some of what you did, which might not bode well for CSR or environmental sustainability perspectives? So we can start looking at why CSR disclosures have to be assured or have to be validated. And the reason why assurance is so critical is that it helps to deter the criticism that CSR reporting is simply some kind of marketing communication gimmick, or it's a simple PR tool. So some proponents or some who argue against CSR say, look, companies don't carry out CSR for any altruistic reasons. They just carry them out because of the marketing communication benefit they'll get, or the marketing benefit they'll get, or the PR benefit they'll get. So ultimately, CSR is seen only as some sort of brand building mechanism. And assurance of CSR disclosures also matters because all of a company's internal policies, structures, and systems should be externally assured to ensure the credibility of your final CSR report. Because typically, when you carry some sort of independent audit of whatever you're doing, whether it's at the level of CSR or marketing or finance or human resources management, usually when the audit is external, it helps the people who are doing the external audit to give a totally independent and hopefully very trustworthy report of how well you are doing in those functional areas I've just spoken to. So whether it's finance or accounting or marketing or CSR or HR, it's always good when a company's internal policies, structures, and systems are externally assured to ensure that the credibility of CSR report is totally non-debatable. Then assurance also provides guidance on how to develop efficient internal reporting systems. Because what assurance does for you is that it gives you a very clear framework on what to look out for, what to report, and ultimately how these link to the strategic objectives and aims and organizations, and aims and policies of the organization. So the whole objective of CSR reporting can be totally undermined without robust assurance processes. I'll repeat this. The whole objective of CSR reporting can be totally undermined without robust assurance processes. So an additional benefit of assurance is that it gives you transparency, it helps to show a very high level of accountability, and it gives added value to your corporate social responsibility report. Now, even though I've just espoused some key benefits of assurance of CSR reports, it's very important to mention that sometimes in resource challenge contexts, in some developing nation context, in some small and medium enterprise context, companies are reluctant to undertake CSR assurance activities because they perceive the cost of these assurance activities to be too high. And additionally, they are not too certain sometimes of the merits of conducting external assurance for the CSR activities. And you can understand, I mean, if you spend maybe $1 million, $1.5 million to maybe drill some boreholes, or maybe provide some sanitation facilities, or maybe provide some educational scholarships for people in a certain area where, for instance, you are conducting mining activities. Intuitively, the CEO of that mining firm might wonder, why do I need an external audit agency or an external firm to come and now assure the quality of my CSR disclosures? I mean, those arguments will seem valid if you say you can't afford the CSR assurance disclosure I'm speaking to. And because of this same argument, CSR assurance sometimes is more associated with internationally connected or multinational firms operating in Ghana. So if you take big firms like Nestle or Tulo or Unilever, you don't need to guess that these firms will definitely undertake some CSR assurance. Conversely, it could also be argued that for local firms or small or medium enterprises, CSR assurance is not something that they will undertake rigorously. And sometimes only regulation and its enforcement can bring about a change in the attitude of local or SME firms towards CSR assurance. Now, the reason why scholars like myself, my colleagues in human capital management, my colleagues in accounting, my colleagues in occupational health and safety would continuously argue that CSR assurance, the assurance of CSR disclosures totally matters is that nowadays, it doesn't matter whether a local company operating in Serekunda or Kanifing in the Gambia, a local or small company operating in Ikeja or in Ilukpeju or in Ikoyi in Nigeria, a small or medium enterprise company operating in Kotobabi on the Spentex Road or operating from Teshinungwa in Ghana. Nowadays, local firms are increasingly finding themselves connected in global value chains. Additionally, local firms are also looking to partner several foreign firms who are either coming into Africa to work, or local firms in seeking to export or go international are also connecting with globally relevant companies as well. What that means is that once you want to become global from an initial local position, this whole argument about assurance of CSR disclosures increasingly becomes important. So small and medium enterprises operating on any part of this beautiful continent of Africa should really consider this issue of assurance of CSR disclosures because of the validity, the reliability, the transparency, the accountability that will be brought to bear on the quality of the CSR activities when these activities are audited and reported on and assured by some external audit agency. Now, like I was saying, my thesis here is that local Ghanaian, Gambian, Senegalese, Moroccan, South African, Kenyan, or Zambian firms must increasingly embrace the culture of conducting assurance on their CSR reports. And my argument here is that some strong regulation or policy framework will really assist in this regard. Why do I say this? About 3-4 years ago, Ghana had the blessing of passing a CSR policy under the Ministry of Trade. So Ghana's national CSR policy was some kind of broad policy framework that discussed key ways by which CSR can be conducted in Ghana. I think one shortcoming of that framework was that it just stopped at making broad policy directions on how CSR should be conducted. But if we could have moved beyond just the policy framework and sort of as a part two, or maybe as a continuation of that original framework, managed to develop some new policy framework or additional policy framework or some sort of regulatory regime that came under the auspices of some regulatory agency, and that made CSR reporting assurance mandatory, I think the whole discourse could change. Because you see, once it's law, it's policy, it's regulation, firms operating in Ghana or in Nigeria or in the Gambia will be motivated to conduct this CSR reporting assurance. And another important element that will be needed for the smooth and proper implementation of CSR reporting assurance in Ghana or any part of Africa would also be capacity building. Because it's one thing to say that you need external audit agencies coming in to audit your CSR activities and consequent reportage. It's another thing to say that small firms operating on this continent will build the internal capacity they need, the frameworks they need, to now start collating CSR data in a more systematic manner. Because once those frameworks begin to characterize these small and medium enterprises, then when it comes to reporting, they can conform ab initio to what to be a good assurance framework. So that when the audit is done, by and large, they already will know how to report, and the assurance process will be better facilitated. So we argue here that CSR assurance will also become more prevalent if CSR disclosure becomes a mandatory exercise. I remember I worked several years ago with the Danish International Development Agency, Lawfields Consulting, and PricewaterhouseCoopers to sort of develop Ghana business codes. This is about 15 years ago. And the thinking was that if the Ghana business codes, which were sort of designed after the UN Global Compact, became mandatory, and everybody was working on it, and everybody was conducting CSR in a fairly systematic manner, then reporting on these activities becomes much easier, and it becomes mandatory. And as companies report systematically on their corporate social responsibility activities, the next phase in that sort of evolution will be to see how credible these statements are. And once the issue of credibility and transparency comes in, then most companies would be sort of motivated again to conduct assurance on their CSR activities. So all said and done, CSR assurance will be critical. I think it will migrate small and medium firms to the point where they become more appetizing to international partners who want to work with them in Africa and other places. And then also CSR dollars or CDs will be spent in a more systematic manner, and a better line can be drawn between the conduct of CSR and the attendant strategic benefits that could accrue to firms who conduct CSR activities. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll come back your way again very, very soon. Thank you.